They didn't know who was sitting across the conference table. They thought they were walking into the easiest negotiation of their lives. They were wrong, but let me take you back to where this story actually begins, because nothing about that moment happened by accident. I was 22 years old when I told my parents I was dropping out of business school to become a paramedic, not transferring, not taking a gap year, dropping out entirely, walking away from the degree they had spent years telling everyone at church about, the one my father mentioned at every family dinner like it was his own accomplishment. I had 1 semester left, and I was done. The reason wasn't recklessness. The reason was Marcus. Marcus was my boyfriend of 3 years, the man I had already decided I was going to marry, and he had just been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia at 24 years old. The hospital bills were already stacking up. His mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't keep up. His insurance had lapsed. I loved him, and I refused to watch him drown alone. While I sat in a lecture hall learning about quarterly projections, I told my parents on a Sunday evening, at the kitchen table where we had eaten 1,000 meals together. My mother put down her fork. My father set down his glass, and then they said the words that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. My father said if I walked out of that school, I was walking out of this family too. My mother didn't disagree. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think people sometimes soften these moments when they tell them later. It didn't feel like a dramatic movie scene. It felt like the floor disappeared. It felt like every assumption I had ever made about being loved unconditionally turned out to be a contract I hadn't read carefully enough. There were clauses, there were conditions, and I had just violated them. I left 2 days later with 2 suitcases and Marcus's address on a piece of paper. We got married at the county courthouse 3 months after that. No reception, no flowers. His mother cried. A nurse from his oncology ward who had become like family to both of us stood as our witness. I wore a pale blue dress I bought for $30 at a consignment shop on 5th Street, and Marcus wore the one button-down shirt that still fit him after the weight loss from his first round of chemo. He looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a room that kept tilting, and I looked back at him the same way. I became a certified paramedic 11 months later. Marcus died 14 months after our wedding. I don't talk about those 14 months often because they belong to him and to me, and some things aren't meant to be shared. What I will say is that I held his hand through every infusion, every blood draw, every morning when getting out of bed felt like scaling a mountain. I learned more about the human body and the limits of medicine during that time than I ever could have inside a classroom. I watched nurses and paramedics and doctors work, and I understood for the first time that this was what I was supposed to do with my life. Not because tragedy had broken me into it, but because caring for people in their worst moments felt like the only work that made complete sense to me. After Marcus passed, I had nothing left to be afraid of. Grief does that sometimes. It strips away the fears that used to feel enormous and leaves you standing in the wreckage, realizing that you are still standing. I signed up for paramedic certification courses the month after his funeral. I worked double shifts at a diner 6 nights a week to pay for them. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that had a radiator that only worked intermittently and a window in the kitchen that didn't close all the way. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Dot, used to leave containers of soup outside my door on nights she could hear me come home late. She never made a production of it. The containers were just there. I ate them standing over the sink at midnight more times than I can remember, and I thought about what it means to take care of a stranger without being asked. I thought about Dot every single time I later responded to a call. The year I turned 27, I was hired by Mercy Regional EMS, and within 2 years I had become one of the highest-rated paramedics on the crew. My supervisor, a 20-year veteran named Ray, told me once that I had what he called the instinct, the ability to stay completely calm in chaos while simultaneously processing 7 variables at once. He said not everyone could be taught it. I told him I had learned it the hard way. I worked my way through night classes at the community college, then transferred to the State University's nursing program on a partial scholarship. I graduated with honors at 30. I was 33 when I completed my master's in emergency and trauma nursing. By the time I was 35, I was the clinical director of emergency services at Hargrove Medical Center, a mid-sized regional hospital that handled everything from farming accidents to multi-vehicle highway pileups, serving 6 counties. My name was on the department. My protocols were being used by 3 other hospitals in the state. I had built something, piece by piece, year by year, in a life that my parents had essentially handed back to me at the kitchen table 13 years earlier and said, "We don't want this. I had no contact with them during any of it. Not a card when I finished my certification, not a call when I was promoted, not a single word when Marcus died. I had made peace with that, or something close enough to peace that I could function inside it. I had a life I was proud of. I had colleagues who respected me, patients whose lives had genuinely been different because I showed up, and a small group of friends who had become the family I had built by choice rather than by birth. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end identified himself as an attorney. He said he was calling on behalf of my parents. My first thought was that one of them had died. He quickly clarified that both of them were alive. He then told me, in the measured tone of someone who had clearly rehearsed this, that my parents had recently retained his firm for a legal matter that involved me directly. He said he would prefer to discuss the details in person and asked if I was available to meet later that week. I asked him to tell me what the matter was. There was a brief pause. He said that Marcus and I had been legally married at the time of his death, and that Marcus had left a small life insurance policy, $38,000, that had been paid out to me as his spouse. My parents, he explained, were claiming that this payout constituted a marital asset that had been accumulated during a period when I was allegedly still financially dependent on them, and that they were entitled to a portion of it as reimbursement for my upbringing and the educational expenses they had covered before I left school. I let him finish. Then I asked him to repeat the part about the reimbursement. He repeated it. I want to be transparent about what went through my mind in that moment, because it wasn't rage. Not at first. It was something quieter and more unsettling than rage. It was the specific disorientation of realizing that people who were supposed to love you have spent 13 years calculating what you owe them, that somewhere, in whatever life my parents had been living without me in it, they had looked at my name and seen a debt rather than a daughter. Marcus had worked summers through high school to fund that policy. He had kept paying the premiums himself, even during the months when he could barely afford his prescriptions. He told me once that he wanted to make sure I would be okay, that, if the worst happened, I wouldn't be starting from nothing. And now someone wanted to take it. I told the attorney that I would be happy to meet with him. What I did not tell him was that the meeting he was proposing would be taking place inside a building where I had a reserved parking spot with my name on it, in a conference room that my department had booked for a routine inter-facility coordination review, and that when he walked in and looked across the table, he would be looking at the clinical director of emergency services. I didn't tell him any of that because he hadn't asked. He had not done a single minute of research. I found that out later, that he had agreed to take the case without verifying anything about who I was or what I did for a living, operating entirely on my parents' description of me as their estranged daughter who had received a windfall. The image they had apparently painted for him was of a woman who had stumbled into some money and didn't know what to do with it. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at 9. I arrived at 7:30. I reviewed the relevant statutes one more time, though I had already gone over them with my own attorney the week before. The case had no legal merit whatsoever. The life insurance payout was a beneficiary designation, not a marital asset subject to third-party claims, and my parents had legally and explicitly cut off financial support for me when they asked me to leave their home 13 years earlier, which my own attorney had already noted would make any claim of ongoing dependency essentially impossible to sustain. We weren't worried about the legal outcome. What I was thinking about, sitting in that conference room with a cup of coffee and the morning light coming through the window, was something different entirely. I was thinking about the $30 I had spent on that blue dress, about the soup containers outside my apartment door, about Marcus squeezing my hand in a hospital hallway and telling me that whatever happened, I had already made him proud, about every night shift and every textbook and every moment when it would have been easier to stop and I didn't stop. I was thinking about what it had cost me to build this life, and about the fact that the two people who should have been proud of it had instead hired someone to come and take something from it. The attorney arrived at 5 minutes to 9. He had a younger associate with him. They were shown into the conference room by my assistant, who offered them coffee and water and didn't mention anything about who I was. My parents came in behind them. I hadn't seen either of them in 13 years. My father's hair had gone fully gray. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, though I understood that was probably just the effect of time and whatever story I had been carrying about her in my head. They both sat down on their side of the table and looked across at me, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then the attorney opened his folder, looked up, and said, "Good morning, Dr. Calloway." Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. He said it the way you say it when you've just realized the name on the folder is also the name on the wall of the building you're sitting inside. My father's expression changed in a way I don't have the right words for. I said good morning. My attorney, seated to my left, slid a preliminary response document across the table. It outlined, clearly and without theatrics, why the claim had no legal basis, and what our counterclaims would look like if the matter proceeded to litigation. The attorney across the table read the first 2 pages, and was quiet for a long moment. He asked if we could take a brief recess. We stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass partition, I watched him speak quietly to my parents for several minutes. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. My father was looking at the table. When we came back in, the attorney said his clients had decided not to pursue the matter further. That was it. No lengthy negotiation. No dramatic courtroom moment. Just a folder being closed, and a case being abandoned before it ever really began, in a conference room in a building where I had spent years learning how to keep people alive. My parents and I sat across from each other for a few seconds after the attorneys stepped away to handle some paperwork. My mother said my name. Just my name. Like she was checking if I was real. I looked at her. I thought about everything I could say. I thought about the kitchen table, and Marcus, and the $38,000 that had been the last thing he ever gave me, and the 14 months I had spent at his side while my phone stayed silent. I thought about Dot and her soup containers, and what it looks like when someone chooses to care for you without conditions. I said, I hope you're both doing okay, and I meant it. Not because what they had done was acceptable, not because 13 years of silence was something I had simply gotten over, but because I had spent my entire career watching people in their worst moments, and I had learned that carrying bitterness is its own kind of emergency, slow and quiet, and just as damaging as any acute injury I had ever treated. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. And for Marcus, who had loved me well enough to know the difference. I walked out of that conference room and went directly to the emergency department, where I had 3 back-to-back coordination meetings and a staff review to get through before noon. By the time I sat down at my desk that afternoon, I had answered 14 emails and approved 2 new intake protocols. The legal matter was dropped formally by the end of the week. I never received an apology from my parents. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this sometimes get tidied up in ways that aren't quite true. There was no tearful reconciliation in a parking lot. There was no letter slipped under my door. There was one brief, stilted phone call from my mother about a month later, in which she said she hoped things could be different going forward, and then ran out of things to say. I listened. I told her I had a meeting and I had to go. I wasn't cruel about it. I just told the truth. I don't know what the future of that relationship looks like, and I have made peace with not knowing. What I do know is that I built my life from nothing, in the truest sense of that phrase, from 2 suitcases and a piece of paper, with an address on it and a conviction that love, real love, doesn't come with an invoice. That is what Marcus taught me. That is what Dot and her soup containers taught me. That is what 13 years of emergency medicine, of holding people's hands in the worst moments of their lives, has taught me over and over. You cannot put a number on what a person is worth, and the people who look at someone they were supposed to love and see only what they can recover have already lost something far more valuable than whatever they came to collect. I still have the blue dress. It doesn't fit the same way it did at 22, but I've never once thought about getting rid of it. It's folded in the back of my closet, behind my scrubs and my spare lab coats, in the apartment I own now, in the neighborhood I chose, in the city where I built everything from the floor up. Sometimes I open the closet and see it there, and I think about that courthouse, and Marcus straightening his collar in the bathroom mirror, and the way he looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a tilting room. I try to be that for people, every single day. I think I'm doing all right.